Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl. Welcome back to Compassion in a T-shirt, where we explore the science and practice of compassion and living a good life. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce a very special guest, Dr. Emiliana Simon-Thomas. Emiliana is a leading expert in the neuroscience and psychology of compassion and a range of related pro-social concepts such as kindness, gratitude, awe, that not only enhance our relationships but also bolster our health and happiness. She serves as the Science Director of the Greater Good Science Centre at UC Berkeley, where she directs the Research Fellowship Program and co-instructs the wildly popular online courses The Science of Happiness, The Science of Happiness at Work, as well as the more recently developed Pathway to Happiness platform. Emiliana is also the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science, a comprehensive and groundbreaking resource that deepens our understanding of compassion from biological, psychological, and social perspectives. Her work sheds light on how compassion can help us connect, care, and make our way through life's difficulties and conflicts, essential skills in our modern world. In her academic career, Emiliana earned her PhD in cognition, brain and behaviour at UC Berkeley, where she examined how emotions influence decision making. She learned that emotions help guide our decisions and offer something beyond using pure logic and reason alone. And so her research program began exploring the origins and effects of pro-social states like compassion. Her research bridges the gap between rigorous science and practical applications, offering pathways to cultivate meaningful and compassionate lives. Get ready for an enlightening and inspiring conversation. She's such a great science communicator. And so I bring you Dr. Emiliana Simon-Thomas. Let's get started, I guess, actually. Yeah, Dr. Emiliana Simon-Thomas, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I wish I had the t-shirt on, but I guess it's a metaphorical t-shirt.
Yes, there you go. It absolutely is. You were an editor on this remarkable book, the Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science, published in 2017. And you were a co-author on chapter one, I think, The Landscape of Compassion, Definitions and Scientific Approaches. And so I wondered whether we could start there and maybe, what is compassion and how can we study it, I guess.
Sure. I like to define compassion as a trait-like characteristic. It's a way of walking the world, a way of thinking about oneself and other people, and an orientation to pain and suffering that is nurturant and care-oriented. I know that when we study compassion, we need to think about it also as in a thin slice way, right? As a
Mm.
specific emotional response to a particular context or antecedent, as we like to call it in emotion science. And in that case, it's a feeling that emerges in response to the perception of suffering or pain that comes with an urge or a motivation to do something to alleviate that suffering.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's really beautiful. I look forward to sort of going back and hearing again how you describe that because it really captures something quite moving, not least just that way of being in the world. It is, isn't it? It is like we might sort of wake in the morning and just set that intention, I suppose, set that intention of how we might want to be in the world and with people and just aware and being moved by things that we see, moved to the point of wanting to be helpful, I guess, in a sense,
Yeah,
is
yeah, that's
basically
right.
it.
And those two ways of thinking about compassion are interrelated, right? An individual who readily experiences compassion in response to some of the pain and suffering that they might see or hear about or just bring to mind in the world is also a person who's likely to score higher on a measure of dispositional compassion. And exercises and activities and practices that are meant to strengthen compassion will lead to a person experiencing compassion more robustly and more readily in response to, situations where they encounter suffering and pain. So there is this kind of synergistic relationship between the emotional aptitude or capacity for compassion and the overarching, more characteristic personality of a compassionate person.
Mm. Probably one of my absolute favorite compassion articles of all time was your article with colleagues, Compassion and Evolutionary Analysis and Empirical Review. That was 2010, I think, or something like that. And I go back to that article quite a lot. And it sort of, in a way, was some of the beginnings of me really getting interested in this topic. But I wonder if you could sort of explain kind of what this notion that compassion evolved, I guess, as a biological drive, and what that really means, and how it helps us to care for and connect with others.
Sure. So I was really lucky to be a co-author on that paper with my colleague Jennifer Getz and Dacher Keltner. Um, I felt unqualified at the time, but super excited to think deeply about compassion and to work with them. My background was really contributing the neuroscience and the biology to that thinking. And Jen and Dacher had more expertise in the evolutionary scholarship and in thinking about compassion from a social psychological perspective. But what we argue in the paper really is that compassion as an emotion emerged into the human mental experience and related or underlying biology as a core motivation for caregiving, right? We have to have this feeling that drives us or kind of creates the urge to invest our resources in the welfare of others. And one of the reasons we needed it was because as a species, we have extraordinarily vulnerable offspring, right? Human infants are born pretty incapable. Sure, they can
Mm.
breathe, sure, they can
Yes.
wiggle, right? They have certain reflexes, but they really can't survive on their own, and they can't survive for a really long time. Upwards of 40 years. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, that's
But
right.
quite some time, right?
Yeah.
Parents are in this position of needing to invest a tremendous amount of resource into a very vulnerable creature that relies very holistically on the parent for survival. So I think in order to be willing to do that, right, there isn't a reciprocity there
Mm.
in the 5-10 year term. And so in order to be able to do that, there had to be this emergent motivation system that was sensitive to vulnerable suffering and willing to approach and nurture without the expectation of return. And that, in my view, and in the view of our paper, is really the origin of compassion.
Mm. Yes, there was the sort of the caring for vulnerable young, and we were talking before, about sort of our adult children, and yeah, mine still need a little bit of all of that, despite being young adults. So it takes a while to develop and to become, independent. So we had to have that sort of motivation to care for our vulnerable young. And then the paper does sort of go on, I think, to sort of say, there's also the kind of just caring for vulnerable others as well, those who perhaps were
Yeah.
sick or injured or elderly or disabled, that's been part of it too.
I mean, the neat thing about the nervous system and human biology is that there's rarely a process or a mechanism or a structure that only does one thing in one situation,
Mm,
right? So we develop this caregiving response to vulnerable suffering that is crucial to our passing on our genes and the next generation surviving. But it doesn't have to only be about that, right?
mm,
Ultimately, it's helpful in other contexts. So,
Mm.
in helping us form other meaningful relationships, in creating communities. I know that Darwin has is quoted often as being the pioneer of survival of the fittest. But actually, closer reading and looking at the whole of his writing, he advocated for sympathy. And in many regards, sympathy and compassion have some overlap conceptually, although some would argue they're slightly different. I think when Darwin was talking about it, he was using the word sympathy in the same way that I would use the word compassion. And his
Yeah.
argument was that species that actually had a robust capacity for compassion were actually more likely to survive. So
Mm.
it's not the case that it's all about, sharp teeth and big muscles and brawn and force and the ability to overtake another species. It's also super valuable to be ultra social. And
Mm.
part of being ultra social is the capacity to be attuned to, concerned with, empathize, and motivated to support and assist each other as a collective.
Yes, it's kind of like one of the key human fitnesses is actually caregiving and receiving and compassion, and that is really a sort of a big part of what helped us to survive. Um,
That's
uh,
exactly right.
hmm, yeah.
That's exactly right. It's not that Darwin's wrong. It's how popular sources sometimes interpret what fitness means, right? It's
Yes.
not
Yeah.
how strong you get from your regular gym workouts. It's who you are as a
No.
person and how well you get
Yeah.
along with others and
Mm,
how willingly you extend your own resources to benefit the welfare of
mm.
others.
And how certain characteristics kind of fit with the context, I suppose, and help with survival. I think the other maybe a third thing that was in that paper was mate selection. Was that part of it as well? I thought that was reassuring that kindness and compassion are one of the things that people
Yeah,
use
I
to select
mean,
a mate.
so early on, a lot of the evolutionary psychology discussions were about features, physical features, like, oh, male members were attracted to female members who had a particular ratio of body properties that made
Mm,
them seem more fertile, or women were attracted to men that were taller, or just these basic physical features. And actually, when you ask people, right, when
mm,
you go out on the street and do these casual or observational interviews, like, what do you want most from a mate or from a partner in your life? Kindness,
mm,
supportiveness, warmth, generosity, those come first on the list. Like, sure, there's this kind of physical attractiveness and attraction part of romantic bonds, but that is brief in many respects, and it's driven by more traditional reward pathways in the brain that habituate over time, the oxytocin pathways that enable and strengthen these long-term, interdependent, meaningful social bonds are what are central to our more lasting relationships in our lives, and the ones that we're willing to invest compassion into.
mm, mm. One of the things I've really appreciated about your work too over the years has been just how you've been really great at translating a lot of the science into and communicating that science, to the public and to your students and through blogs and but also through the Science of Happiness program. I did that myself many years ago. Although I didn't do the test at the end to get the PD points, I must admit, but I did do the program.
It's
But
okay. It's
yeah,
overrated.
right. Well, it's a fantastic course, and you've developed all that, I suppose, into the Pathway to Happiness kind of platform there. And I suppose I wondered if you could, yeah, tell us a little bit about the. I mean, this is a big question, but the science of happiness and where compassion maybe fits in as well.
Yeah, well, for me, I started with compassion. No, that's not true. I started with trying to understand how emotions influenced higher order thinking and decision making. That was my PhD work. And at the time, it was easy in a neuroscience lab to evoke unpleasant emotional states, right? You can just show somebody something kind of disgusting or frightening or aversive, and most people react in a pretty similar way. And then, so this is what I would do. And then I would ask them to perform a kind of demanding cognitive task, like remember where an object on the screen is compared to an object that appeared, 3 trials earlier. So you're kind of having to remember, hold stuff in mind, working memory. And I was just really interested in testing this question about the role of emotions in reason because I had a distaste for the popular notion that emotions are somehow the enemy of reason. I just didn't think that that was true. I also was motivated by case studies of people with damage to their orbital frontal cortex who actually, because of that injury, no longer were able to incorporate emotional information into their higher order thinking and decision making. And they were not functioning well, right? If emotions are the enemy of reason, having them taken away should make you like really reasonable. But in fact, people with orbital frontal cortex are certainly not. They make very impulsive choices. They're limited in terms of their social appeal and interactivity. So there's lots of challenges. So anyway, that's what I was interested in. Filed my dissertation. But before that, when I would give talks, there were kind of 2 main people that would come and ask me questions. And one of them were people who were interested in emotion. And they would say, well, why are you only studying unpleasant emotions? And the other were the neuroscientists. And they would say, why are you even studying emotions at all? Like what is important is the, cognitive processes.
Mm.
And after I finished that work, I got really interested in expanding the range of the kinds of emotions that I was studying and understanding their relationship to higher order thinking and cognition. And I was lucky enough to start working with Dacher Keltner, and he was specializing in what are called pro-social emotions. I had also just become a parent myself, and so I was kind of, overwhelmed with a special kind of pro-social urge and motivation. And so we worked together to try to understand what goes on in the brain when people experience compassion, what some of the physiological signatures or indices or profiles of other pro-social states like love of humanity or the experience of awe might look like. And as I was investigating those experiences, I just kind of, I don't know, stumbled into this repeated finding and reported result that those pro-social emotions like compassion and gratitude and awe and affection or love of humanity were really tightly linked to well-being. The
Mm.
people who did those, who had those experiences easily and often, were the same people who scored high on measures of happiness. And I thought, okay, that makes a lot of sense anecdotally in my personal life. I grew up in a really close-knit, big family, lots of emotions, but largely centered on a profound closeness and love for one another. And that's sort of how I ended up teaching about happiness. I was really
Mm.
interested in compassion, understood what it looked like and what different processes were involved and how one might practice in a way that would make compassion the likely response instead of a number of other ways that you might respond to encountering pain and suffering. And all of those things that you might do to get better at compassion in the same breath make you a happier person. And
Mm.
so we called our course The Science of Happiness because we knew it would be like quickly appealing to a lot of people. And in fact, it was like we launched this course in the fall of 2015. Um, actually, scratch that, the fall of 2014.
Mm.
And it was the same year that Pharrell Williams came out with that song Happy,
Happy,
which
yeah.
a lot We love it, but it got played a lot, so maybe you don't want to hear it every day anymore. But um, I don't know. We thought we're going to get 20,000 people in this course. That's what lots of massive open online courses get. It's going to be great. We're going to feel really accomplished. We had 125,000 people from all over the world enroll in this course. Again, I mentioned Pharrell Williams because I think it was like top of mind for people, this idea of I'm happy and I can be happy and I have some agency over my happiness. Look, here's a class. I'm going to go take it and learn how to do it. So people come in, I want to be happy, tell me about happiness. And for some, I think it's disappointing because we don't say, we're going to show you how to feel good all the time.
Mm.
We don't say we're going to show you how to be really successful, earn a lot of status, be beautiful, have a vacation house, buy the fanciest new car that your neighbor has. That's not what we're going to teach you. We're not going to teach you about how to be successful or how to check off the list of aspirations and goals that you might have that are, admired in your particular cultural background. No, we're right away going to tell you that actually to be happy, you have to be kind. You have to be
Mm.
generous. You have to be um, immersed in mutually supportive, meaningful relationships with other people. And you have to feel like you matter and you matter to the community that you're in or the place that you live. And that's the stuff that we can work on. That's the stuff we can help with. People can really try different ways of prioritizing their time and energy or engage in little exercises and activities that can shift their habits of thinking about themselves and other people and the choices that they make in a way that increases happiness. But again, it's really through the channel or through the modality of compassion and other pro-social states and behaviors.
Mm. Wow, that's a really beautiful summary. And people, perhaps it was Pharrell Williams, and we can give him a nod, but also
Yeah.
people are just wanting that stuff, aren't they? That they know that well-being is important to them, and they're sort of hungry to understand what are sometimes there's disappointment there, I suppose. There's not a magic bullet, although it's a powerful kind of process when the interactions that we have with others. I mean, we're just such a sort of a social species, and that's kind of what matters at the heart of it. And also, I suppose, interactions with the world around us. That's the awe piece in a way, isn't it? Is just really interacting with the world and being open to kind of those experiences as well. What were some of the compassion sort of practices, because you mentioned there, practices that people could do, and how might that have impacted well-being, do you think?
Yeah, well, one of the helpful ways to begin to talk about compassion building practices is to break compassion down into a couple of underlying component processes. Um, and we do this in the paper that we were talking about earlier
Mm,
in our conversation. If you try to imagine compassion as that like response to a specific situation, um,
mm,
so let's take an example of a person in your workplace who is unexpectedly sobbing, right? Their faces in their hands, their shoulders are shaking, and they're clearly deeply and profoundly upset, right? And you encounter this as a colleague, not particularly deeply close to this person, but there's a couple of things that could happen. One, you could try to avoid it, right? You could just go, oh, I saw it, but I don't want to interact with that. So I'm just going to like walk by quickly and look the other way and avert my gaze. Um,
mm,
that would not be compassion, right? That would be, escaping from the situation to begin with, not tuning in at all. A second way could be to kind of approach this person or try to figure out what's happening. Maybe, say, are you okay? What can I do? How can I help you? And as you're doing that, um, really lean into how this pertains to your own experience. So, oh, this is making me feel kind of bad that they feel bad. And oh, it reminds me of another time when something really terrible happened in my life and I wanted to sob and I don't know how to fix this or help them. And that makes me feel bad about who I am and what I'm capable of. So I'm just feeling increasingly overwhelmed and distressed. And again, I want to leave. Like this is
Mm.
unpleasant for me. I want to leave. That's not compassion, right? We've attuned, but we've had this whole other series of thoughts and interpretations and judgments that have made it impossible for us to engage in a compassionate way. And then, of course, the third is we approach the person, we ask them how they're doing, we feel moved in our own right and in our own physiology mirrors something of what that person is experiencing. But instead of interpreting that as, oh, this is a threat to me, this is my problem, I need to worry about my safety, we interpret that as almost extra arousal that is giving us the fuel to be generous, to be
Mm.
supportive, to offer whatever it is that we can give in that moment, even if we can't fix whatever it is that they're struggling with. They may tell us that they got in a car crash and they're really sad that it's going to cost a lot of money and their family's going to be angry with them. There's nothing you can do to fix that, but you can sit there and you can, offer a comforting presence. If they're somebody who you have a friendly companionship kind of relationship with, you can put your hand on their shoulder and say, I'm so sorry. That's really hard. I understand how difficult that must be. Is there anything I can do to help you? What could I do to support you in this moment? You can just
Mm.
offer what you have and what you can, and that's compassion.
Mm.
And so when we train people to get more compassionate, there's this kind of high level way, which is just a value proposition. I want to be compassionate. I'm going to think about what it means. I'm going to try to imagine myself as a more compassionate person. And then there's the componential approach. Like, what do I do when I encounter someone? Do I try to ignore it because I don't want to feel something? Okay, let me practice feeling things with other people. Can I really look at somebody and actively listen and solicit their sharing of the feeling that they're having so that I have access to that? That's an exercise in that empathic attunement. I just want to be there and feel it. So that's one kind of way of
Mm.
increasing or enhancing or enabling empathy. The second thing is, how do you interpret that own feeling in your own body, right? If you interpret that as threat, fear, catastrophe, you're not regulating your emotional experience in a very constructive way, right? And we need to do that all the time, not just when we encounter other people suffering, but when we have our own difficulties in life, when we have our own challenges. It's really valuable to be able to reappraise that experience in our body as, okay, this has some potential opportunity for me to learn and grow, or how can I use this arousal or physical state to actually move in the direction that solves the problem that I'm having, rather than panic or freeze or just fall apart. So skills of self-awareness, of
Mm.
noticing our mind, skills of um, managing our judgments about ourselves and other people. Do we when we encounter suffering and we empathize with it, do we then think, oh, it's going to be too hard, for me to do something to help them, so instead I'm just going to like suppress this feeling and try to escape, right? It's a very
Mm.
common and reasonable coping response for the individual in a self-focused way, but it's not compassion, and it deprives a person of the opportunity to build a meaningful relationship and to experience the warm glow of offering support. So if we
Mm.
put our cost benefit analysis a little bit further ahead, instead of being like, well, right now I could take away the cost of helping and just, you know, preserve my resources, and instead go, yeah, I could take away the cost of helping, or I could give the help knowing that that help is going to have these long-term benefits, both in the moment when a person starts to feel better and we empathize with that relief and that contentment of being in relationship, and then also in the long term as we build a meaningful connection with that person. So
Mm.
when I think about building compassion, I really do think about all the little pieces, all the little parts, and all the little processes, and how we can build each one of those up And then I also tell the story of how building each one of those up is not just good for compassion, it's also good for your own happiness. It also
Mm,
makes you a more balanced, connected, and sort of uh, meaning infused person. And
mm.
that's what's so important to your happiness.
Yeah, yeah, that's so great because it reminds us that compassion is about suffering, I guess, and to
Yeah,
approach suffering or to be in the presence of suffering is tricky. It's hard. It we feel it, and we can sometimes have that distress that arises for us personally. That has a motivating effect too, I guess. But it sort of motivates us away from that suffering and to relieve our own distress. So there's a kind of a emotion regulation, distress tolerance element or skill, I guess, to compassion that we can build up. But we don't want to be unmoved by what they're going through either. We want to be able to have that sort of sympathetic concern or something that we feel for the person, but without making it about me, I guess, or
that's
something like that. And so
that's
staying
exactly right.
sympathetic. And then there's that empathic piece, the empathic resonance, I think you said that we then really stop and listen and sort of understand the person and what this is like for them and what this means to them and what might be most helpful. So there's these little sort of building blocks and skills that we try to cultivate. And ultimately, it's great for the person we're being compassionate towards, and it's that twofold benefit thing, I suppose, where it's kind of great for us too, and helps with well-being and happiness in the end.
Yeah, I mean, that's the story I tell. And so far, I haven't had anyone or any finding or any paper make me feel like there's anything amiss or
Mm,
misguided about it. I just feel, and of course, I'm an infant compared to thousand-year-old traditions who have been telling this story also about the importance of compassion and the potential to
mm,
build compassion and the importance of embracing pain and suffering as part of human experience. That's
mm,
another little myth we bust in the science of happiness.
mm,
When we say, we're so glad you're here, sorry, we're not going to teach you how to feel good all the time. That's not
mm,
what happiness is, right? Happiness is a rich fabric of a landscape of many different, very unique and meaningful emotional experiences. And yeah, sure, you don't want to be stuck in an experience that is always unpleasant and distressing and painful. But anger, fear, sadness, these basic human experiences are fundamentally adaptive and they motivate us to behave in our lives and in our relationships in ways that solve the problems that have caused those feelings.
mm,
So we feel angry when we face injustice, and that motivates us to get active and do something to challenge whatever circumstance is behind that injustice.
mm,
When we have a irrevocable loss, we feel sadness, we cry. When we cry, other people are drawn to us, right? Those
mm,
are wonderful, fascinating studies about, when females, when there are men and women together and a woman is very sad and crying, the smell of a man's olfactory experience of a woman's tears calms their kind of aggressive impulse, right? They're
mm,
less aggressive. So there are these ways that those emotions are so fundamentally responsive to the realities of human experience. We're not going to be able to escape irrevocable loss. So let's embrace it and figure out what to do with it so that we can learn and grow and develop relationships in the wake of those kinds of unpleasant experiences. So that's
mm,
focus. And compassion helps when we develop those regulatory skills, when we lean into empathy and open our hearts to the experiences of other people and feeling something around other people. That doesn't just help with compassion. It also helps us feel really great when we're around other people who are really joyful,
that's
right? If
true.
we open up that empathy channel, we can have sympathetic joy, right? Another person gets recognized for their incredible accomplishment. We feel so joyful about that instead of Oh, I'm not good enough, or comparing ourselves, or feeling jealous, or any number of other emotions that probably aren't making much of a dent on your happiness level.
Mm. Well, you mentioned before that the science of happiness and so on has really kind of just gone everywhere. Like globally, hundreds of thousands of people have gone through the course or used the practices and so on. What have you noticed in terms of diverse cultural backgrounds, orientations, beliefs? Have you found that there are ways that that can be adapted to sort of, make more sense for people or to kind of, or are you finding that there's a really a common thread across everyone that this makes sense to?
That's such a powerful question, Stan, and I think the answer is both and.
Mm,
The Greater Good Science Center has drawn largely from the literature, the scholarly literature in positive psychology. Other disciplines and other fields also, but mainly from academia. And in the US, academia is pretty narrow when it comes to the populations and the participants and subjects who have been studied in the research experiments. And
mm,
so there is a fair and really important critique of a lot of the exercises and activities and practices that have been drawn from positive psychology, which is that they're really meant for and work well for the populations who they were tested on, right? And those tended to be weird, right? Western,
mm,
educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, right?
mm,
There's certain kind of background that is represented in the actual science itself. Um, we're very aware and cognizant of this at the Greater Good Science Center, and this hasn't made us pull back and decide, oh, we're not going to share anything at all until we fix it all. Instead, we're totally committed uh, to a program of community embedded research where we're talking with people who have different cultural and socioeconomic and ideological backgrounds and getting their perspective on some of the exercises and activities and practices. As an example, we had one student at UC Berkeley who conducted focus group individual interviews in depth, and then also focus groups where he had Black members of the community come in and read through some of the practices and say, how does this work for you? What do you think? Does this kind of resonate? Would you do this? And if you wouldn't do it, but it reminds you of something that you would do, what would that look like? And so
that's a
here we're
great
really
question.
just trying to offer, and then in this humble a way we can say, this is what we've got from the science. How can we make it better? And then we sort of have to turn around and re-examine some of the impact and efficacy studies that have been done, but not in that more diverse way. Some of our work is doing that now, not in in a biological sense, but because we have and now over 1 million people who have done the science of happiness, and our Pathway to Happiness program, which is sort of like Science of Happiness, but without all the articles and explanatory videos. It's, a person can just join, and then we just say, here's the instructions for practice. Do this for this week. How did it go? And then come back. Here's the instructions for your second week practice. Do this for a week. And in that program, we're also trying to invite and include a global sample. And we're using people's self-report self-report data, posts within the platform. So for example, if one of the exercises is to make um, a list of three good things in your day, people actually post that into the platform. So we have lots with permission, of course, from the people as they sign up. We have lots of self-report responses to questionnaire data and engagement data, as well as posted actual practice data from a very diverse sample. And I'm working with a team of scholars to try to understand, like, which of these works best for, you know, men with a Latino background who live in the southeastern United States. Like, is
Mm.
it the case that a self-compassion letter is really powerful for them in a way that's unique? And the next time a person who tells us that's their demographic background joins, will we send them to that particular exercise first because we want to do the thing that is most helpful for them? Now, that's not helping us change the practices. It's just helping us understand a little bit more from what we have, what could work best for whom based on what's going on in their life and what their individual characteristics are. That we
Mm.
call precision well-being. But
Ah,
anyway,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I like that. That's a good term. There's such a rich kind of qualitative slash quantitative data that's coming in, I guess, really, and with people's permission and consent and so on. But it's definitely giving us a lot of food for thought, I suppose, in terms of the different ways in for the different populations. I mean, for example, I did a workshop recently online for a group in Poland, and it was even difficult to work out just which Polish word it was that captured compassion in terms of, how I was thinking about it and presenting it. So even at that level, I think it takes a lot of thought and kind of consideration in the translations and so on. But also, as you say, the kind of the actual practices themselves and what works.
Yeah, yeah. We're doing the same kind of investigating with a second program that we built called Big Joy, which was a
Mm,
really fun project, Stan. We did this in partnership with some filmmakers who made a movie about the friendship between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. It's a documentary film and really inspiring, really beautiful. You hear about their struggles and their activism and their life stories. And at the end, the filmmakers, they came to us and said, we want to build an impact campaign. We want people to have something to do at the end of watching this movie when they feel inspired and moved. And so we worked together to build a 7-day kind of sequence of little activities. We call them micro acts of joy. But one of them, for example, is list 8 things that you feel grateful for. And when
mm,
you join this Big Joy program, you register, you tell us a few things on a pretty brief onboarding survey, and we ask people to tell us how they're feeling right in the moment. So, how are you feeling? And then do this exercise, or we call it a micro act again. And then we ask, how are you feeling right after? So we're getting a different kind of self-report data, still limited by the constraints of asking people to tell you what's going on with them. But unlike Pathway to Happiness, which is 4 weeks, and we're asking people to think back how differently they feel one day from 7 days earlier or 28 days earlier, here we're asking about emotional experience just before and after, right? Just before
mm.
and after. And that's helping us also understand what's the emotional impact of engaging with these exercises, and how does it differ based on people's individual characteristics and the particular exercise itself. That's very exciting, and lots of data. So yeah,
Mm,
more to
mm.
come.
I just suddenly thought of I think it's from that 2010 paper as well, to be honest, but the idea of compassion is not boundless, that we have these various appraisals that we might make of the sufferer and does that come into your Science of Happiness or Pathway to Happiness sort of coursework, if you like, the sort of exploring one's own appraisals?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think we call them mental habits just
Hmm.
because people who aren't, trained in psychology, appraisal is not like people think of like the value of your house if you say appraisal in
Okay.
the in the
Yes.
United States. So
Right.
sure, yeah, when people have a really pessimistic approach to understanding the world around them, they're likely to sort of take a different path than compassion because they're just going to think about the unlikelihood of any impact of their engagement in the situation. Um, So what I think you're asking about, though, is either something called compassion collapse or something called compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue, I don't think is a real thing. Compassion collapse is something that I've tried to describe in our conversation, but I'll point to the point at which it happens again. So compassion fatigue is the idea that like you only have so much energy to feel compassion. I actually think that true compassion is not depleting. It's not something that requires extending of resources. And I say that with two important points of clarification. One is compassion isn't limited to things outside of yourself. And we can't think of, if I'm going to be a compassionate person, then I need to spend every waking moment and every drop of my energy helping other people, other people, other people. No, pain and suffering is all of us. And I, as a human, experience pain and suffering. And when I am experiencing pain and suffering, that compassion has to work in that direction also. I'm sure you're familiar with Kristen Neff and the whole science of self-compassion. But I like to just argue that compassion is like it's omnidirectional. It's 360 degrees. And to the extent that you are applying a nurturing and caring stance to pain and suffering in a way that is supportive, that's not costly, right? It's regenerative. And so I don't really buy the story of compassion fatigue. What I think is the mistake that gets made is calling compassion fatigue what is really empathic distress fatigue. So
Yes.
empathic distress fatigue is if I see you really upset and I start to mirror that feeling because I'm an empathic person, and then I start to think about that feeling that I'm having as a threat, a worry, something costly, something potentially harmful, something upsetting, like that kind of ruminative, self-focused appraisal is costly. Right now, I'm feeling bad, right? And so that bad feeling over and over again, if you do encounter pain and suffering outside of yourself and you don't notice or attend to the pain and suffering within your own self, yeah, that's something that becomes overwhelming. But that is in many ways an indication of not having actually ever felt compassion, right? You just never actually felt it. You were stuck at that point of empathic distress. Now, compassion collapse is a little different, and it's when people sort of decide that there's nothing they can do. The classic study that outlined compassion collapse, and this is by my friend and colleague Daryl Cameron, was to ask people how empathic they felt towards an individual who was clearly suffering, and also ask how willing they were to offer support, to nurture that person. And most people are actually pretty willing. They see this person, they feel like, oh yeah, I really want to help. And then the next condition is 5 people. The next condition is 25 people, and then 100 people. And if you're thinking linearly, you might go, oh, gosh, the more people there are, the more motivated you might feel to approach and do something and lend your hand in any way that you can. And actually, no, what people do when they feel like they don't have any path to helpfulness is suppress the feeling and think, it's not something I have any power to help with. And so I'd rather not see it at all than acknowledge my own inadequacy in this situation. Also, very reasonable coping strategy. But, in an ideal society or community, it's not all up to one person. There should never be one person who is the purveyor of compassion for everyone. That's not going to work out. That's not going to help the collective, right? Compassion in many ways is evolved for the sake of supporting collectives and individuals in collectives. If we didn't have collectives, if it was just you by yourself, you wouldn't need compassion, right? You would need some kind of self-care thing, but you wouldn't need compassion, right? You wouldn't need that orientation. So there is this kind of like situational optimal condition for compassion, which is that there's a willingness that it's shared and expressed in a shared way. It's not up to the solitary individual. Because when a person feels like it's all on me, I'm the only one here who is being compassionate, then you're likely to end up at compassion collapse.
Collapse. Yes, I'm so glad you went to compassion fatigue and compassion collapse, because that was definitely my next kind of question too, is because you came to Brisbane and presented at the UQ Compassion Symposium, and you sort of presented, compassion fatigue, no such thing. And I have a slide on some of my workshops where with the photo of you and me, and then this kind of newsflash sort of thing that sort of makes the point about that you really just beautifully summed up around compassion fatigue's not quite right. It's often maybe just fatigue and burnout, and the problem sometimes with the word compassion fatigue is it puts the onus on the helper, that they're fatigued and they need to do something about their own fatigue, and it forgets the whole system around that, which can be a part of what might lead to burnout and so on. I've got a couple more questions, but then I will let you go. But I suppose the next question's a bit of a big one, so I'd just be interested just in your thoughts, briefly if you like. But I suppose just that sense at the moment in the world of division and conflict and tribalism, and that it just seems kind of palpable, really, in some ways. And I suppose I'm trying to think, how do we bring compassion in there, in those sort of more challenging situations where people are kind of in a different motivational state, I guess. They're in a more competitive, kind of adversarial motivational state. I mean, do you have thoughts how we could do a bit of that, bring strength and compassion in those more difficult circumstances?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked that. It's the elephant in the room, or in the world, I should
Yes,
say.
it is. Yeah.
One of the things that we learned about empathy, that kind of early response to another person, and empathy doesn't have to only be about pain. I'm kind of insistent when I teach about empathy that people should remember that we can have empathic amusement. We can have empathic pride, right? Empathy is simply being able to mirror and to some degree simulate the same state, not exactly the same, but some semblance of the same state that another person who we're around or we're thinking about is expressing. One of the early things we learned about that is that if a person thinks that another person is really, really fundamentally different from them, their response is dampened. So I might feel like, oh, Stan, you're such a nice person. I've had really nice conversations with you. I see myself as a nice person. We both care about compassion. We have all this stuff in common. And if something happened to you, I would have a very reflexive kind of empathic response to your experience. But let's contrast that with another person. Now let's pretend their name is Francesca, and Francesca hates compassion and, shakes her fist saying that, greed is the, route to human success, and anybody who thinks otherwise is stupid, right? That's Francesca. Now Francesca is here and she's suffering and sad. Studies would suggest that I would feel less empathy towards her than I would towards you. That difference, that ideological difference, and it also shows up in cultural difference. It also shows up in other ways that, we might think that we're fundamentally unique from another person's humanity. And I think a lot of the strife that we're grappling with these days is about that. It's about feeling like I can't possibly imagine any thread of commonality between this person who believes something different than I do. And as long as I hold that, that insistent separation, it is going to be really hard to extend compassion because I don't even feel that first step, right? That first step of empathy. I can, in my mind, at a kind of holistic way, say I'm going to try to extend compassion to them, like intellectually. And I don't think that that's necessarily wrong or less important. It's just not as deeply felt, right? It's not as much of an embodied experience. And so I think in many ways to try to uplift and like awaken or peel back the barriers to that innate urge to be compassionate towards each other is going to lie in finding common humanity, in figuring out like what do we have in common, right? And it might have to start with something really mundane, like Francesca and I. Well, we've both are our mothers. We both have kids. That's something pretty profoundly common between us. That's a big quality of my life, and I will assume a big quality in hers. What else? I want my children to be safe. She wants her children to be safe. Okay, we're getting somewhere, right? I can relate to her. She can relate to me. We may believe really different things about how what leads to success of humans or societies. But as long as there's some way that there's a common understanding or some shared humanity, that will open the door for the possibility of an exchange that's meaningful and maybe of compassion, of extending compassion between us.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the ways I like to do it is, they were a child once too, sort of a thing, is something that often helps with that common ground, common humanity, connecting at some level. It's so funny because, I mean, the obvious example of this is somewhere like sort of Twitter or X or somewhere where it's just these sort of this rage posting. And I'm sort of still on there and I put out these little compassion tweets or whatever and no one cares. There's all this sort of rage going on and it is tricky to cut through sometimes with these messages around kindness and compassion and forgiveness and gratitude and it's sort of, but mind you, you're obviously doing a wonderful job of it with all of your programs. So
Well, we're
that's helping.
trying. We're
Yeah.
trying, but it's been 10 years and I have to wake up in the morning sometimes and go, it's little steps. It's little
Mm,
steps. I can't we're doing the best we can, and sure, we haven't reached, peace on earth around the globe, and there are still people who are hungry and unhoused, and
mm,
and there's still a lot of ideological conflict and confusion, but if we weren't doing what we're doing, how much worse would it be? So
mm,
I just got to
mm,
kind of keep believing that it's of value and that it matters. And Stan, I'm really, really fortunate. I get to go places and talk to people who have taken my classes. Actually, last
mm,
week I was in Hong Kong teaching at a monastery, and I had, for the last 4 years, offered a virtual Science of Happiness class for this organization through our partnership. And this was the first time I had gone in person. And all these, like, just like hundreds of totally wonderful strangers who I evidently had seen in little boxes on my Zoom screen for hours, but couldn't possibly feel that sense of depth and connection and affection to them because of the virtual digital modality, came up to me and said, what we did and what I learned was so important to me. I
mm,
really was able to manage something extra challenging. The 4 years that I taught covered the COVID pandemic. They covered the political uprisings and
mm,
strife, ideological polarization in Hong Kong and
mm,
geopolitical affairs. And there was a lot that people were grappling with. And so I am so lucky to get not just my own, self-talk validation, but also appreciation from people who do learn this for the first time and do actually have some kind of epiphany that they would rather live with compassion and generosity and just a simple belonging with their community than whatever else they might have aspired to in response to kind of cultural messaging and advertising powers that be.
And it spreads, I guess, is the idea, that sort of each person then kind of starts to talk about it with others. And my very last question, I did notice that you were part of a paper this year that was looking at your online interventions, wellbeing interventions, and engagement. And I thought that was a fascinating part of it too, is the certain things that seem to predict greater engagement, and wondering whether there were other things that you have worked out can actually help to build that engagement with the online platforms. And
Yeah, I mean, it's such a multifaceted challenge. The first thing we did was the Science of Happiness course, right? And that was 10 weeks.
yeah.
And like, 30-minute videos, maybe even longer, page long, 10-page long articles, like really in depth. And, it's quite common for a massive open online class to have a retention rate of like 5%. We were very proud to have somewhere between 12 and 15%. We were like, oh,
Beautiful.
we've really succeeded. That's great. But still, that's not very good, right? If I had a restaurant and people only ate 15% of the food that I made, I would feel pretty diminished by that.
Right.
So we did shift over to Pathway to Happiness, trying to provide something a little bit lighter, a little bit more accessible. And then our most recent project was the Big Joy Project, which that paper is about, which is just 7 days. And in all three, we do get a fair amount of drop off, and we know who drops off, and we're really interested in iterating and adapting our practices and our programs so that we can make them more accessible and appealing to the people who do drop off. One of the examples that we've already talked a little bit about is that people from underrepresented groups in the scientific literature tend to drop off, right? People who are not white, people who are not women, people who haven't achieved as high education levels tend to drop off of these kind of, development, online optimizing, well-being related programs. But then the other kind of wild part of that is that some of the people who drop off, for example, people who report experiencing a high degree of financial strain. Okay, so here's somebody who really is struggling to make their ends meet. And somehow they see Big Joy. Somehow they sign up. They do 1 or 2 days and they don't do the rest. And then there's some who have the same circumstances and they sign up and they stay for the whole time. Now they're the minority of the high financial strain group. Those who stay in that high financial strain group, they show a bigger benefit. They get more out of doing that week-long program than the people who are experiencing financial privilege. So rather than saying like, well, people who are not interested, let's just let them find the thing that they like and not work harder to make this available to them, our data strongly motivate us to figure out how can we make this easier for people. Of course, there are structural and systemic factors that I can support and advocate for it in my role as a citizen. I don't want there to be people who are experiencing extreme financial strain, right? That I don't like inequality, and I can vote and advocate outside of my primary life's work for that. But in the meantime, it's 100% my commitment to continue to develop resources and programs that will be of service to the biggest variety of individuals as possible. through our learnings from our research and iteration and analysis, and also from our engagement with people who are underrepresented in the scholarly literature, where we actually get their advice and reward them appropriately for it. So,
Mm.
so yeah, it's a moving target. Some people are interested in different formats, and ideally, like with time and more data, we'll be able to be more precise and learn what a person wants. Do they like writing a lot? Would they prefer meditations? Would they benefit most from socially extroverted activities? And I'm part of another team that's looking at interventions that are in the service of emotional well-being. And one of our pilot grants went out to a scholar at UCLA who is looking at, yeah, just what's the impact of behaving in a more extroverted way? Does that
Mm.
end up improving a person's emotional well-being? It might, and it might for certain people, depending on what they bring to the table. So I'm so glad you asked that. That's like the frontier. That's the
Hmm.
exciting cutting edge work that I'm doing to make what we have and what we offer even better and more accessible and appealing to more people.
Yeah, and trying to enhance engagement is sort of the $64 million question, but it's also the biggest bang for your buck in a way, because, to
Mhm.
help people engage and to go through the program, it helps. It makes things better.
It helps a lot of people. And then, the Greater Good Science Center has a lot of other more hands-on offerings for those who really need that in-person, deeper
Hmm.
engagement. We have a Bridging Differences program with communities of practice that bring people together, both in person and virtually, just to talk about trying exercises and activities, how they work, what challenges they face, how they solve some of those challenges. Of the same kind of programming for in our education program, where our team helps education professionals, teachers and principals and school employees just try it, right? Try these things and then come together and talk about what's working. And if something doesn't work, let's figure out an alternative approach and see if that can work. And that's like, in the trenches, holding hands kind of work that
Hmm.
we can also do, but it's harder to scale.
Mm. Well, Dr. Emiliana Simon-Thomas, you are really an amazing person. As you probably can tell, I've been following and appreciating your work for many, many years and continue to do so. And I also just really appreciate you coming and talking with me on compassion in a t-shirt.
Nice. Well, I'm honored to be here. I hold my memories of visiting with you in Australia many years ago very fondly. They come up on my phone every once in a while, or my kids get it on their phone, and everybody goes, "Oh, remember that time we went to Australia? That was so great."
Yes.
So thank you for that. And
Yeah.
I am equally a fan of your work and this way that you're continuing these rich conversations. I know I'm one of many extraordinary, esteemed guests that you have invited to be on this program, and I'm truly honored and humbled to be amongst that group. So thank you for having me. I appreciate
Well,
it.
thank you very much. Thank you.